Okay, thank you. So I'm Jussi Leinonen from Meteoswiss, as Mark said, and I'll be talking today about our efforts to do thunderstorm nowcasting with machine learning, and particularly nowcasting using multiple data sources at the same time, and in a way that we can also do seamless nowcasting. So just for some background of the project, this is funded as a EUMETSAT fellowship, which started about 1 year ago at Meteoswiss in Locarno Monti in Switzerland. And there are basically three main objectives for the fellowship. So first, we want to evaluate the benefits of the Meteosat third generation satellites for thunderstorm nowcasting. Second, to use advanced machine learning techniques like convolutional neural nets with the Meteosat data from both the second generation as well as kind of MTG-like data. I'll explain later what that means. And third, to develop hazard-specific nowcasts for different hazards, so as we can provide warnings for specific hazards for the end users. We have some heritage from previous nowcasting projects at Meteoswiss, such as the Coalition series of nowcasting algorithms, as well as the so-called Thunderstorm rank or TRT algorithm. And in this project, we are in collaboration with Hewlett-Packard for their expertise in high-performance computing, with the University of Bern for hail studies, and with the University of Alabama in Huntsville for their expertise in thunderstorm nowcasting, and especially in the United States. And there is a similar EUMETSAT fellowship on the same kind of topics in Vienna in Austria. And we're trying to stay in communication with them as well. Although I'm not sure what the status of that fellowship is right now. Last I heard, they were still looking for the fellow. Sorry, my slides are changing kind of slowly. Okay, so in the first part of this talk, I'm going to talk about a study on the importance of different kinds of data sources when we do thunderstorm nowcasting in a machine learning framework. And so this is basically motivated by the need to develop these short-term warnings for thunderstorm hazards, which are highly localized and they develop quickly. And using numerical weather prediction, it's hard to predict the time and location exactly, while plausibly we can do something like that with actual measurement data in the near past. So if there is a cloud that we see in our measurements, we can pretty much tell that the cloud is going to be there also in the very, very near future. And if the cloud is, for example, producing lightning, well, it's probably going to be doing that also in the near future. But on the other hand, then in the further future, this kind of extrapolation from the measurements is not as reliable. And then we can go more into the physically based models to predict thunderstorms. And then we can combine nowcasting with some numerical weather prediction data. And to do this in a way where we transition smoothly from this observation-based nowcast to a measurement, or to numerical weather prediction-based nowcast is called seamless nowcasting. And as this kind of a statistical prediction problem, machine learning has a lot of potential for nowcasting. But one problem is that there is a lot of data available, and it's not really always obvious what data sources one should use. And as one particular point of interest in the context of this fellowship, we wanted to look at okay, what kind of benefits will MTG be able to offer for thunderstorm nowcasting? So in this study, we wanted to evaluate the contributions of different data sources to the nowcasting, and then provide guidelines for later studies to select the right sources for their application, whether they be our studies or somebody else's. And we also wanted to nowcast concrete hazards rather than some kind of abstract indicators for thunderstorm intensity. So for example, we want to predict the presence of lightning or heavy precipitation or hail, etc. And so that we can compare the results, we want to use the same machine learning methodology for all these hazards. So when it comes to MTG, it has a higher resolution imager with more channels, and it also has a lightning imager. And so as I mentioned, we wanted to know what advantages MTG might be giving us. But MTG is not flying yet. So instead of using European data for this study, we instead do this study in the United States, where similar kinds of instruments are already operational in the GOES-R satellite. So that has the ABI instrument, which is very similar to the MTG upcoming imager, and there is also a lightning imager called the GLM on the GOES-R series of satellites. And so in the United States, we decided to go into this area in the northeast of the US, which has a similar climate as Central Europe. It's also at kind of similar latitudes. So we're faced with similar issues when it comes to the satellite data processing, for example. And so these are our data sources. So as I mentioned before, we have the GOES ABI imager and the GLM lightning mapper. We are also using radar data from the NexRad operational network that's used in the US. You can see the locations of the radars that we're using in the orange circles in the plot here. Then we are using numerical weather prediction forecasts from ECMWF and some digital elevation model data from the ASTER model. We got the model data, and so we got all the data really for April to September of 2020, and collocated everything to a single grid, so we can easily analyze that. So for an overview of the strategy we followed here, so first we extract storm tracks from the radar data, then we compute features for those tracks. We create training, validation, and testing data sets. And then we train a machine learning to predict the different hazards. And from the machine learning models, then we try to evaluate the importance of the different data sources. So for the first part of the outline, this would be the storm track detection. So we detect storms or the storm centers as local maxima in the radar reflectivity that we see in the NexRad data. And then we use an open source software called PySteps that has an optical flow routine that we use to compute the tracks of the storms. Then we extract features along these tracks. So we look at these different variables that we take, and then we look at things like the mean, the standard deviation, etc., of these different features along the storm track, and we end up with something like 4,000 features and about 80,000 samples. For the machine learning method, we are using gradient boosted trees. So this is method using decision tree models that are regularized in a certain way. And they use a series of these decision trees in a way that the subsequent trees always try to improve on the results of the previous trees. We use an implementation called LightGBM for this, which is nice for our purposes because first, it's fast to train, even if there are a lot of inputs. Like in our case, we have thousands of inputs. And we can also easily compute the feature importance from LightGBM, which is a very nice thing for the purposes of this study. For the machine learning targets, we use the radar reflectivity, which stands in for precipitation. We use the lightning occurrence from GLM, and also the presence of a 45 dBz echo in the radar data, whose height is related to the presence of hail. So as the first result from the machine learning study, we look at the evolution of the radar reflectivity, which again is standing in for the precipitation. And we actually noticed that this is a fairly difficult task. So if we look at this, sorry, to get that back. If we look at this plot here on the right, this orange curve is showing what we would get from the prediction of the reflectivity just based on the persistence assumption. So just assuming that it stays the same from the t equals 0, the reference time to the future time steps. And we actually noticed that this persistence assumption is somewhat biased because of the way we select the data. And so the thunderstorms are more likely in our data sets to get weaker than they are to intensify. And that's why when we just correct for this bias, we get this red line for the error. And so that actually gets us already pretty far. And then here in the blue line, we are showing the results for the gradient boosting. So we don't get such a huge improvement just over this bias correction from the gradient boosting method. But anyway, it's quite consistent over time, and it outperforms at least this bias corrected persistence every time. So however, for predicting the occurrence of lightning and for the existence of this 45 dBz echo top, we get somewhat nicer results at 86–87% accuracy. So that's a little bit more encouraging there. So looking at the feature importance, which we can get from the gradient boosting predictor, we can see here on the left the most important features for the occurrence of lightning. So if we look at the top rows here, these are features that come from the GLM, which is not so surprising because the whole feature is defined based on GLM, and so for predicting lightning, the lightning detector is the most important. But we also get some contributions from things like the radar variables. And here in the bottom, we can then see the total contribution from a given instrument. So in this case, the most important here is the GLM, which is shown in purple. And then if we go to the maximum reflectivity, it's a fairly different picture. So the top rows on the list here show all radar defined features. And the most important here is the column maximum reflectivity. Again, it's not surprising because that's how we defined our feature. And for this predictant, the machine learning model is also telling us that we have quite some importance from the ECMWF numerical weather prediction data. And again, we are showing here in the bottom how this importance of the different data sources evolves over time. And if we look at the ecotop presence, again, here we see that the radar features dominate, but in this case, it's even clearer than in the case of the maximum reflectivity. Another perhaps more interesting way to look at the importance of different features is to consider these different sources separately, and then kind of rerun the analysis using all the possible combinations of sources that we can have. And in this example that we have here, we're showing the error rate of lightning prediction. And you can read these charts by looking at the combination of row and column, and then combining from those, you can tell which data sources are used for a given square in this matrix. So, for example, here on the top left, we have this square corresponds to having all the data sources available, whereas this one here, for example, has the GLM as well as the ABI and NextRed data. And then by looking at these patterns in these plots, we can see which data sources generally are the most important ones. So these dark squares here are the ones where the loss scores or the error rates are the smallest, and therefore the prediction is the best. And so we can see that then in this case, the first two rows, as well as this row here and this row, are the darkest. Therefore, they have the smallest error scores, and unsurprisingly, they correspond to the cases where we have the GLM data available. But also, if we look at this first column here, which is where we have both the ABI imager and the NextRed radar available, in this we also see considerably darker colors than in the other columns. And this also tells us that these instruments actually give us a benefit in predicting lightning. And then we can look at the other predictants in the same way. So we can look at the prediction of reflectivity. And here we see a similar pattern as before, that the NextRed data is particularly useful. But also we get a benefit from having the ABI available, and also to some extent the GLM. And then here in the prediction of the ecotop, it's a similar story, but it's much more dominated by the radar, as we also saw in the feature importance analysis from the gradient boosting models. Okay, so that concludes that part, and we can discuss that a little later. But now I'd like to show a little about our next step in this fellowship, and what we're going to do next using more advanced machine learning methods in the form of these recurrent and convolutional neural networks. So as differences from the first project, we are doing nowcasting directly on a grid. So we're trying to get rid of the uncertainty that is imposed to us by having to track these storm objects. We are also, for this study, we are going to data that is available in Switzerland, so that it's easier for us to use and access. and so that we can port it later to operations more easily. And the biggest difference is that instead of these gradient boosting models, we are using these recurrent convolutional neural networks. So here's an overview of the data sources. So these are basically analogs of what we had in the previous study. We have the operational radar from Switzerland. So here is one example from that. It's the precipitation rate from the radar. We have the Swiss lightning observations. Again, one example here. Then we have the EUMETSAT second generation data. And in fact, at the moment, we are just using the Nowcasting SAF products. We're showing the cloud top height, but we intend to add some information from the raw channels as well later on. And then we have numerical weather prediction data from the model that we're using at MeteoSwiss, which is called Cosmo. And this one is showing the Cape, which is one good predictor for this thunderstorm activity. And finally, we also have a digital elevation model for this project. For predictions in this study, we are using this kind of multi-scale recurrent convolutional network. So this is an architecture that has been used in a few studies before in a slightly different context, including a certain Nature paper that just came out a couple of days ago, which where it was used in a kind of generative nowcasting context. But so basically the idea here is that we get some kind of input time series of images, and it can have multiple channels which represent the different input variables. And so for each time step, we then downsample it to smaller resolutions, but a larger number of features in a typical way that we do with neural networks. But then also on each depth level, we also have a recurrent layer that learns the time evolution of the field. And so we do this recurrent processing forward in time. And then we have a similar network, but now doing upsampling instead of downsampling, where we get back from these deeper features into the original resolution. And again, handling the time evolution using these recurrent layers. And in this way, we can get the output, which in this case, for us, is the probability of a certain extreme event happening. And as a note, we can also do a kind of seamless forecasting or a seamless nowcasting in this way. So we can take the future data, and then we simply don't push it through this input layer, but we instead use it directly to predict the outputs in this output time frame. So future data is most likely going to be some kind of numerical weather prediction data, which basically we have this data for time steps that are still in the future at the prediction time. But this could also be something like optical flow applied to the radar data. So we tested these networks in this competition called Weather Forecast, which was organized by this institute in Austria using data from the Nowcasting SAF products. And we actually managed to get the first place in the stage 1 of this competition, which is pretty good news for the future stages of this project. So here is one example of what we were predicting in this competition. So here is the Nowcasting SAF product, which indicates the probability of tropopause folding. And we saw with this that so So these two here are the best data points, and this is what is really happening in the future. Excuse me. Yes, so this top row here is what's really happening in the future, and the bottom row here is what the model predicted would happen. So we can see that the model can predict the movement of this field in time, and it also generates kind of additional blurriness in the later time steps to reflect the growing uncertainty in the prediction. So this is a kind of a different application, but we can still use the same network because it's basically the same problem of predicting the time evolution of these two-dimensional fields. But then for this project, we collected training data from April to September of 2020. We had some minor problems collecting this data. So now that the April to September, the main convective season of 21 is over, I will start updating the data to 21. We are using here a 5-minute time resolution, and we are trying to predict the next 60 minutes from the previous 30 minutes. We consider regions where the radar reflectivity somewhere in the area exceeds 35 dBz, which corresponds to about 10 millimeters per hour of rain. For training, we use a loss function called focal loss, which I won't cover in too much detail here. And we use rotation and mirroring for data augmentation. And everything is implemented in Python using TensorFlow and Keras. So here are some early results that we get using this method. So we are trying to target specific hazards as we did in the previous study. And in this case, in the bottom of the screen, I'm showing the prediction for the occurrence of lightning. And we do this in a probabilistic manner. So the output of the model is the probability it believes that the event will be happening. So on the left here, we have the radar data. So perhaps we can see here from these single images is a little bit difficult to notice, but we have some of this movement from kind of the bottom left towards the top right. And here on the second row, we have the lightning data. And then we generate this prediction here. So this is actually nicer to visualize using a video. So let's take a look at that now. So we can see some of this movement that the network has detected. And we can also see that it gets more blurry over time from the kind of sharper prediction in the beginning, which again reflects the growing uncertainty as to where the lightning is going to be in the future time steps. And one interesting thing to see here also is that we are in the last frames developing some, or we are predicting some lightning occurrence in areas where we didn't have lightning in the data that we looked at. So this tells us that the model is actually using also the other data fields besides the lightning to do this prediction. Okay, so we're getting close to the end, but just to mention some challenges that we had during this project. So first is that these image time series are quite big. So they require large amounts of computation and especially large amounts of memory, because we're not just talking about a single image, but a whole series of images. So fortunately, we have at MeteoSwiss available a multi-GPU cluster where we are able to do this. That helps especially with the limited amount of, or with the huge amount of memory that these models require. Also, pre-processing the data can be quite a challenge, and we had to use some quite clever techniques to get around these problems. Also, the time that it takes to transfer data from the CPU to the GPU can be a bottleneck. Another complication is that these extreme events that we're trying to predict are by definition rare. So we use this weighted loss function, which is basically paying more attention to the cases where these events are happening. This is necessary to get the model to predict more than just the climatology. But it also means that we cannot anymore really strictly interpret these outputs of the model as probabilities. And so I'm showing here on the right a kind of preliminary look at the predicted probability on the x-axis from the lightning model, and then what the actual occurrence of lightning was in those cases. So this is a very nonlinear curve, and we see that basically for any predicted probability of less than 0.5, there is almost no chance that the lightning is actually occurring. But at least this curve is monotonic. It's increasing, and it goes pretty much from 0 to 1. So we can use this kind of curves as a post-processing step to recalibrate the probabilities coming out of the model. And then as a final challenge is, how should we handle missing data in this case? So one particular example is we might have some precipitation data or cloud data. And in this case, we basically have two kinds of missing data. One kind of missing data can be, well, there is no cloud, so we can measure it. But that is still information to the model, because if there is no cloud somewhere, there is very unlikely to be lightning there. But on the other hand, we just might have missing measurements, that the measurements haven't been made. And then there is really no information to be gotten from there. But what is the best way to convey that information to the model? I'm not sure yet, but that's something we need to think about more, because we have sometimes these measurement gaps in our data. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the summary. So the results of this initial study have been submitted as a paper. That's in review, and we have actually submitted our responses, but the preprint is available in this address here. Also, this application to the weather forecast competition was accepted as a workshop paper. So in the ongoing work, we are going to refine further these convolutional networks, and we have to also further develop these analysis and calibration methods for the outputs of the networks. And then in the future, I expect we're going to write a paper later on about this neural net nowcasting study. And in the end, we want to make this operational in applications in Switzerland, as well as elsewhere in Europe and in the world. So that concludes the talk. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you very much indeed. We do have quite a few questions on the Slido. Rosa, would you mind to share the Slido screen, please? A couple of them are sort of more administrative around the nature of the seminar. So I guess, yeah, okay, first one, great presentation. I'm interested in using TensorFlow and Keras for nowcasting. So do you just want to give people pointers on, are there any other papers that are written, particularly in terms of nowcasting, on people who are applying those libraries for nowcasting? Do you know of the sort of published bits and pieces? What could people Google, basically?
There are many examples of using neural networks for nowcasting, but I'm not sure which library each paper was using. I think at least some of them have been using TensorFlow, but PyTorch is another popular alternative. I'm not really sure which paper has been using which implementation.
So I guess a Google within Google Scholar will get you quite far on that if people are interested in following that up.
Yeah, and if you'd like to discuss this with me, I feel free to send me an email.
Great, thank you. So next question, which is more about the lightning, which may or may not be your thing. Can monitoring electrical charges be used to monitor thunderstorms?
Huh, I'm not really sure. I haven't really heard of that, but you would have to ask somebody who is more of a domain expert in this particular area of lightning prediction and detection.
Yeah, I mean, so there are surface-based networks that measure, for example, delay propagation in high-frequency signals to do that kind of thing. But of course, your presentation was more also about what can you do when you've got some data.
Right. Yes.
So, get it, DWD. In your opinion, what's the potential for exploiting MTG for thunderstorm nowcasting with generational neural networks, such as Ravuri 2021 does rainfall nowcasting with rainfall data?
I'm not sure what the particular input of MTG is for that. I know that MTG has more bands, and particularly it has a higher resolution. So that kind of high resolution data should be something that convolutional neural networks can kind of naturally exploit in a perhaps a better way than other machine learning methods. And that should apply also to generative neural networks like this recent paper from Ravuri et al. Because we can use higher resolution inputs. But that would be very interesting to look at. Perhaps some of you know that I have been doing a lot of work with this kind of generative neural network analysis of atmospheric data.
Okay, thank you. So question from Africa, what would be the impact if there is no radar data?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons that we looked at this kind of data source analysis to see what happens if we drop the radar data, for example. And one particular point of interest for us was like doing nowcasting in areas where the radar data is just not available, like in over the oceans, but also in some countries that just don't have these networks. So do you mind if I share my screen again?
No, go for it. Do take it, yeah.
Okay, we have to go back a little. For some reason, these slides are changing a little slowly. Okay, here we go. So here in the in these plots, you can see the effect of what happens if we take away the radar data from the prediction. So, for instance, in the for instance, in the case of predicting the precipitation intensity, if we look at this first column, or actually we should look at the second column here, which is showing the cases where we have just an X-rad, but not the satellite. Or the first one is showing that we have both. And so these have somewhat better performance than this third column where we only have the satellite data from ABI. But we still get a considerable benefit from having the ABI available as compared to this fourth column here where we don't have either of them, and then we're just relying on these other three data sources, so the DEM, the NWP data and the lightning detection. We see that the performance, yes, it does degrade if we take away the radar, but having just a satellite imagery is much better than nothing.
Yeah, I think that was quite an exciting thing to see, because there are quite a few people who don't have access to radar data for whatever reason, and I think to be able to show that lightning plus imaging, in fact, maybe even producing products downstream, so combined products might be quite an interesting thing. That's kind of cool. Rosa, could we jump back to the Slido, please? Thank you. Yeah, okay. So that's Laura Lewis. I think it's Laura. Yeah, Laura Lewis, who would like to get in touch with Jussi. What we'll do, so you've now got Laura's email address there, Jussi.
Okay, and I'll also put mine here in the chat in case anybody has some further questions to me.
Brilliant, thank you. And also, Laura was also asking about TPU. So what is a TPU and are they used?
So TPU is the specialized piece of hardware developed by Google that is developed for specifically this kind of neural network operations. So we're basically doing very big operations using linear algebra, and parallelizing this kind of operations is the focus of the TPUs. And in some applications, they are faster than the GPUs. The problem with TPUs is that I think still to this point, you can't really buy them. So you can only use them on the Google cloud service. Personally, I'm using the facilities at the Swiss Supercomputing Center, where we have some nodes that have multiple GPUs. That's worked pretty well for me. But this way we can avoid the need to pay for these commercial cloud services. Although you can use just to some degree on Google Colab. If you go there, you can also use this TPUs for a limited amount for free.
Okay, thank you. Could we localize lightning data with the production of nitrous oxides? So this is more an atmospheric process that happens when you have lightning in the atmosphere.
Yeah, that would probably be a question for somebody else. Again,
so, and I think that's within on the EUMETSAT side, because of course we have atmospheric composition sensors on the next geostationary satellite. So this may be some interest. There's quite some interest in looking at lightning and NOx production. So that's
it sounds like an interesting idea. I imagine though that the clouds might kind of get in the way. Because remote sensing these gases, it's usually more difficult if there are clouds. So by definition, we're doing this in a cloudy environment.
It's true. But and this is, I can imagine actually in the MTG era, one of the things I'm looking for is a lot of cross-sensor type work. So it'll be interesting to see the kind of things that people are able to come out with. Laura, you're very welcome. So last question. So what exactly machine learning models used? Is it linear regression with multivariable or what? And what is the type of data used? Is it the actual images? And how can we use this data? So I think that's somebody who's maybe wanting to get on, just have a little bit more explanation on how you set this up to do your training.
Okay, I wonder if that refers to the kind of the first part of this presentation or the second, but I can answer more generally. So for predicting this kind of quantities like the evolution of the radar reflectivity, we are using the mean square error loss which is basically kind of equivalent to doing linear regression. And then for this kind of variables that indicate the occurrence of some event, we are using cross entropy, which on the other hand is kind of equivalent to doing logistic regression.
And in terms of the actual data you're using, I guess for the ABI, you're using the actual ABI data rather than the image formats.
Yes, we're using the actual data, but yes, it's images in the sense that it's two-dimensional data.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So thanks for the wonderful presentation. Knowing that GBM suffers from scaling up on outliers, how do you handle these? As I believe they could affect the variable important rating and causing overfitting.
Yeah, so with GBM, we were doing quite a bit of work with trying to control the overfitting. So we are splitting the data set into multiple parts. So we have testing or training, testing, and validation sets in a kind of a standard way. And we are using the different regularization parameters of GBM to limit the overfitting. But then, yes, in the end, if we train it too much, then it starts to overfit. And to control this, we use this method called early stopping. So after a certain amount of training, we always check the loss of the model in the validation data set as well. And if the validation loss stops decreasing, then we stop the training eventually.
Okay. So what is the impact of rotating and mirroring the images?
The idea is basically that the network learns to do the same things regardless of whether the same phenomenon is going from top to bottom or left to right or right to left for that matter. So we are imposing a kind of an approximate rotational invariance into the model. And the idea of behind doing that is first to kind of increase the effective amount of training data that goes in the model, so it doesn't see the same training examples as often, but rather that we have more of these different training samples. And so the model doesn't have as much of a chance to memorize the inputs, which is a bad thing for generalization. And another thing is kind of perhaps a little more philosophical, but it's the idea that our neural network should try to learn kind of to approximate the laws of physics behind the evolution of the thunderstorms, rather than just try to memorize what's happening in these different cases. And so if you have this certain kind of invariance in the laws of physics, then it's perhaps a good idea to have those in the model as well. So we have kind of translational and temporal invariance as a result of using the kind of this convolutional and recurrent architecture. And by doing this data augmentation with rotation and mirroring, we also get the same kind of invariance for these kind of transformations.
Okay, thanks for that. So next question, Alexander, and I guess that there are many of us who are just starting out, who one of our big questions is how on earth do you get organized when you're doing this? So can you give a bit of an insight into your workflow, sort of raw data, getting ready to train and test?
Oh, I could give an entire talk about that one, but
yeah, no, it is a huge question. It's good.
yeah. Yeah, I guess it begins with just looking at the data source in a kind of interactive way, looking at many examples of it and trying to figure out the best way to process that kind of data and identifying the different problems there might be. So, for example, do you have some kind of artifacts that are commonly present in that type of data? Are there some instances of missing data? And then you have to decide what to do about those. And once you have a better idea about that, you can start kind of writing more automated data handling code that, for example, you might have some kind of heuristic there to detect some kind of outliers or artifacts, and then throw those out or filter them. And once you have that kind of code written and verified for some kind of limited test set of cases, then you can run that kind of algorithm as a kind of automated data mining algorithm, as in a more or less automated way. So you don't have to actually like test every single data point by hand. And in this way, you might end up with a couple of examples in your data set that are somehow problematic, but usually that's not such a big deal if you have a couple of broken examples, as long as most of your data set makes sense. And then once you have this kind of code ready, then you can use that to create a data set, and then you should also split these data sets into kind of this training, validation, testing data sets that hopefully come from like kind of a little bit different points in time, so there is not too much overlap. So, for example, for this study, I used a setup where I didn't just randomly pick samples that were from the exact same distribution for the training, validation, and testing, but I split the data set in a way that I selected entire days that go to the testing data sets, entire days that go into the validation data set, and then the rest of it goes to the training data set.
And do you, just to actually check, do you put any of your code or anything in it? Have you got a Git or anywhere where you put your stuff that people would be able to see, or?
For these projects that I talked about here, I believe, yeah, so the code we used in the weather forecast competition, it's already available on GitHub. For this first talk I presented here, so this gradient boosting study, I think the plan was to release the code for that when the paper gets finally accepted. And then we have a similar plan, I think, for the second part. So for this neural network study as well. So that's not yet online, but if you want to look at the model and data handling code for the competition study, you already have that on GitHub.
We're getting quite close to the end of our time, so we've maybe got time for one more question. Just before we do wrap up, there was a couple of people asking, so yes, we will be recording the session, and we'll put the recording on the site page. And also, if you do need a certificate, just get in touch, training at EUMETSAT.int. We do know that some of you do need those. So I guess to take the last question, in your opinion, what differences would there be if you use the same algorithm, but did it somewhere else in the tropics, for example, Southeast Asia? So this gets to the invariance question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's a point that gets often raised in the context of neural networks and in the atmospheric sciences, that they don't necessarily generalize. And I don't really have a great answer, but One kind of encouraging example is from this weather forecast competition, where we got basically as competitors, we got training data from certain areas, and then a part of this competition was also to apply these models trained in this particular area or these certain areas and apply it in other areas. So these were all kind of in and around Europe. There was some in Europe, but there are some also in, like, I think Canary Islands and somewhere in the Middle East and so on, and North Africa. So perhaps the transferability is a little bit better there. But anyway, it looked like the transferability in the context of this competition was actually pretty good. So the models that did best in the core competition, which was the prediction for the same areas where we had the training data, those models perform best also in the so-called transfer learning areas where we didn't have that data available. So I find that kind of encouraging in the idea that we could train a machine learning model in one area where we have more data available, and then perhaps apply it somewhere else where we don't have that data.
Okay, so thank you very much for your time. That was exceptionally interesting. I'm really pleased you were able to do it. Do keep an eye on the short courses page and on the training events.eumetsat.in for those who would like to follow more of what we're offering in terms of AI, machine learning, and weather and atmospheric sciences seminars. Thank you, everyone who was able to join. And thank you again, Jussi. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.